Right. So chapter 2, lesson 1, our political heritage. And we know that England was the country that established the colonies that would eventually turn into the United States. That's why we speak English. That's why so much of our culture comes from England, because the people who founded this country, the founding fathers, as they're sometimes referenced, were Englishmen. So what we're going to find out here in this first chapter, and what we're going to do in all of chapter 2, is kind of look at our country now and our government and try and understand why it is the way it is before we get into breaking down the smaller elements of it. The first thing we have to understand is that a lot of our government ideas came from England. So how did England get its ideas, right? And we can go all the way back to 1215. Look, Europe was a place of kings and lords and knights, and 99% of the people being peasants for the 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But in 1215 in England, there was a moment where King John was forced at knife point to sign a document that said that all nobles had certain rights. And one of these rights was the right to trial by jury. So back in the day, sometimes in class, I'll show examples of medieval torture devices, right? The king could just grab you, put you in the dungeon, and torture you, and you could be disappeared. People could never see you again. And everyone just kind of knew that. But by the year 1215, there were a group of nobles who were large landowners, who were lords, had their own castles, had their own knights, had their own mini army, I guess. And they didn't like that, right? They didn't like the concept that the king could just snag any of them and they had no rights, and he could put them in a dungeon and torture them as much as he wanted to. So they grab him, they put him to the ground, they put a knife to his throat, and they say, sign this document guaranteeing that if nothing else, I have the right to trial by jury. Okay, I have the right to a trial of a jury of my peers. We're also going to see that slowly in England, this idea of a parliament gets more and more common. Starting in the 1400s and the 1500s, the English government has a group of leaders called the House of Lords, who are mostly nobles, who have certain powers, one of which was the power to raise taxes. So if the king needed more money, he had to go to the House of Lords, who were nobles, to ask for more money. Therefore, he couldn't do whatever he wanted. This is now the beginning of a government where non-kings, right, so someone other than the king, has a little bit of power. So they say, well, look, king, we'll raise the taxes if you do X, Y, and Z for us. And there's this very slow evolution in England of the king giving up his power to Parliament in order to get what he wants. By the 1600s, by 1689, we heard in our video, right, by 1640, there's a king who tries to take full power for himself, and he is killed. Now, although they immediately regret it, that was a mistake. And after Oliver Cromwell, who leads the parliamentarians who killed him, after he dies, the king's son is given power, and they try and make up for that mistake. But it just goes to show you that in England, they did not want a king who said he had full power. We'll chop your head off, or they did literally chop off his head. And it scares all the kings in Europe. But let's stop there. By 1689, another English leader had come to power, and really a lot of this had to do with the power of the church. Okay, England under King Henry VIII had declared its own church, separate from the Catholic Church, but there were people who wanted to bring the Catholic Church back. And then there were people who said, no, we want to keep the Church of England, where we have more power. So this kind of goes back and forth. Eventually, there's this glorious revolution, and a new king is brought into power from the Netherlands, William of Orange, and they say, "Look, you got to sign this document called the English Bill of Rights, though, which guarantees all English people certain rights, or men, excuse me, and women did not have those rights at that point." And within this document were things like the ideas of no cruel or unusual punishment, right? We're ending torture. The king does not have absolute power and never will. The people have the right to question their government. The king needs parliament to raise taxes. These are revolutionary ideas that he signs in the English Bill of Rights. And it's so rarely discussed. Where did we get the idea for the Bill of Rights? Right here. Okay, in England, 100 years earlier, they had a Bill of Rights that all people had certain rights, especially all men had certain rights. There's a guy named John Locke who's writing during this period saying that it's the government's job to protect people's life, liberty, and property. That sounds a lot like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course it does. 100 years later, Thomas Jefferson steals two of his three ideas from John Locke, 1690 Englishmen. Okay, so we're just going to take a look and try and trace where some of these ideas came from. The representative government would be the Parliament or the Lords. There was also a House of Commons that was elected that had no real power at first, but eventually gains power in England. So we're going to find out that each one of the colonies also have their own